Okay. Good evening. I'm Toby Katz, and on behalf of the Sisterhood of Temple Israel of Great Neck, welcome to another in our ongoing lecture series. Somebody wants to come in. Tonight's topic is New York Jews from 1654 till 1776. This is a two-part series. Tonight in part one, we look at the origins of the first Jewish families to come to the New Amsterdam colony, the origins of the colony itself, Jewish occupations, and civic and political rights. Then we'll examine the same issues when the British took over in 1664. In part two, we'll look at the lives of individual members of these first Jewish families, their lifestyles, occupations, religious practices, relations with their Christian neighbors and the indigenous peoples, and life just before the revolution. And these first Jewish families often had very prominent places in the community. In 1664, the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam surrendered to the British and the name changed to New York. Now, to keep the timelines straight, we'll refer to New Amsterdam when discussing the Dutch colonial period, and then to New York when discussing the British colonial period. So we'll keep our numbers straight. Let's begin with the origins of these first 23 Western Sephardic Jews to arrive in New Amsterdam. They sailed aboard the St. Catherine in September of 1654. And let me, oh, somebody wants to come in.
Toby, I'll handle the admits. You don't have to worry about them.
Okay, fine, thank you. Okay, shall I highlight myself?
You need, if you end screen share, you'll be large again.
Okay, then I'll end the screen share. Okay, fine. Okay, where was I? Okay, now these 23 Western Sephardic Jews sailed aboard the St. Catherine in September of 1654. Actually, we all say these were the first Jews to arrive in New Amsterdam. They weren't. There was another Jew, his name was Jacob Bar Simon, sometimes called Bar Simpson, and he was the first to arrive. He came a month earlier. Now, he was an Ashkenazi Jew, and the Dutch West India Company sent him to identify additional economic opportunities in New Amsterdam, in the New World. Remember, New Amsterdam was controlled by and operated for the benefit of the Dutch West India Company. And as a representative of the Dutch West India Company, he was very welcome in New Amsterdam. Actually, because he was there and he was welcome, he helped collect the ransom to pay the debt of the 23 Western Sephardic Jews who weren't exactly welcome in New Amsterdam. Now, who were these Western Sephardic Jews? Let's take a look at who they were. Okay. Jamie, can I minimize all of us here? Okay. Just give me a moment while I set up the automatic good. Okay, I'm gonna set up the slideshow. Okay. That's this. I'm trying to move this so you can see the, okay. In March of 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain signed the Alhambra decree, ordering all the Jews to leave Spain or convert. If they didn't convert to Catholicism, they had to get out. And the monk over here is Tomás de Torquemada. He was the mastermind behind the expulsion decree and also the Inquisition that followed. When the Jews of Spain were ordered to become Catholic or convert, some left, some converted outright, and some converted but tried to maintain some Jewish practices in secret. This is an artist, whoops. This is an artist's rendering of the expulsion from Spain. And you see, it's very reminiscent, actually. Oh, Lord, sorry. It's reminiscent of the psalm, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down. This is very reminiscent of that. Sorry. Okay. They were waiting. If you see a picture of a horse, actually that's an artist's impression. It was against the law to take horses out of Spain in 1492. That sounds weird. Excuse me while I plug in my computer. Spanish horses were very specially trained for combat. Very specially trained. They could move literally on a dime. They could turn on a dime. And this was very useful. Think of the conquistadores. This was a very useful thing and a very closely guarded military secret. And for that reason, it was illegal to take a horse out of Spain, out of the territory of Spain. So that's why everybody had to go by boat. And if you remember, those of you who have seen the journals that Columbus kept, the very first entry in his journal was explained why he had to delay departure for the New World by 1 day because of the exodus of the Jews. Where did the Jews go? Where did the Jews go? Okay, this is a map of where the Jews went when they left Spain. Some Jews actually went from Spain to Portugal, which is actually on part of the Iberian Peninsula. And the rest went east. The Eastern Sephardim went to North Africa and what was then the Ottoman Empire. But we're concerned primarily with the Jews who left Spain and went to Portugal. They could openly live as Jews in Portugal from 1492 until 1497. Now, in 1497, the King of Portugal demanded that all Jews convert. Excuse me, this is very sensitive. All Jews convert or get out. And although they nominally became new Christians, they were still able to practice Judaism in secret until well into 1536, almost 40 years. In that year, the Inquisition was introduced to Portugal. And unlike the Eastern Sephardim, who went to the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, and who were welcomed for their knowledge of science and their trade contacts, the Western Sephardim stayed in Europe. As the Portuguese expanded their empire into the New World, these new Christians, as we can see by the arrow here, went along. And they established successful trading centers between the Portuguese colonies and Europe. At this time, the Netherlands was ruled by Spain, and Protestant Dutch were not allowed to worship freely. In 1566, the Dutch revolted against Spain and the Spanish monarchy and established the Dutch Republic. The Dutch soon became a world power through a large network of merchant ships and a period of strong scientific, economic, and cultural achievements. The new Dutch Republic was very attractive to Spanish and Portuguese Jews, conversos, who could openly practice their religion and enjoy civic and political rights in Holland. They couldn't come to Holland earlier. They couldn't come to Holland earlier because Holland was still ruled by Spain until 1566, and as new Christians, reverting to Judaism in public would be a capital crime, and they would be burned as heretics. And here we see an artist's rendering of the burning of heretics in the public square. And this is what would have happened to them had they come to Holland sooner. These conversos were welcome in the new republic because of their scientific and mercantile skills and their contact with the conversos who were already in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World, and they could conduct trade with their fellow Jews or former Jews. However, since they had to maintain their Judaism in secret in Spain and Portugal, these Western Sephardim who came to Holland were third and fourth generation removed from the original Jewish population. Their knowledge of Judaism and Jewish ritual was passed down secretly through family and family stories. And they also were passed down through assimilation with Christian practices. They had to learn about Judaism from the Jews who were already established in Holland and had been there for centuries. Incidentally, what was the favorite Jewish holiday of these conversos who were coming to Holland? Their favorite holiday was Purim. Why Purim? Because Purim told the story of a Jewish woman living among and passing as a Gentile, much as they and their families had to do in Spain and Portugal. In 1621, sorry about that. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was established in Amsterdam. It was founded to create trade and to facilitate trade with the New World. It was modeled after the highly profitable Dutch East India Company, founded earlier for trade with the Far East. Several Jews sat on the board of this new company, and the Jewish community supported Dutch expansion into the New World, especially if it would be at the expense of the Spanish and Portuguese. Recently arrived Western Sephardim maintained contacts with the conversos in these colonies and established trade relations that greatly benefited the Dutch. Now, what we're looking at here is the Dutch West Indies Company warehouse in Amsterdam. And we see barges carrying goods going to and from the ships that would either bring them in or take them out from the New World. And this was a very lucrative trade. The Dutch West India Company set up in what would become New Amsterdam. To trade beaver fur skins with the Iroquois who lived in upstate New York. I'm sorry, the indigenous Algonquin people and the Iroquois who were in upstate New York. And here we see a picture of the Dutch traders trading with the Algonquin and Iroquois for the beaver pelts. New Amsterdam was founded in 1624, just a few years later, essentially as a fort to protect the Hudson River, to protect the mouth of the Hudson River, to protect the Dutch merchant ships that we see here, and also to keep the merchant ships of other countries, Spain, Portugal, England, whatever, from sailing up to Albany and taking advantage of the very lucrative beaver fur trade. And if we take a look at, this is the arrow shows the fort. You notice it's shaped like a star. Here's a windmill. Here are the settlements. The original Dutch colony consisted of only 30 settlers. It was very small. In fact, the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, this is very sensitive apparently. The Dutch colony of New Amsterdam actually never grew to a very large size. These are beaver fur hats from the 17th century that were immensely popular in Europe. Beaver fur was popular because when it was felted, it made hats that were waterproof. So you didn't need an umbrella, even if you had an umbrella. And you had that. And these are styles of beaver hats that were very popular at this period. Peter MINUIT, the first Dutch Governor General of New Amsterdam, bought Manhattan Island from the indigenous Canarsie people. Canarsie is in Brooklyn. And he didn't pay with $24 worth of trinkets. This is an artist's rendering of his dealings with the Canarsie Indians. This is an example of what Peter MINUIT probably really looked like, as opposed to the artist's rendering. Now, for those of you not familiar, Canarsie is in South Brooklyn. And the native peoples from Canarsie, whom Peter MINUIT dealt with, never lived in Manhattan. They fished off Manhattan Island. If you remember, you saw the long fishing boats in the other picture. But here this man came along and said, hey, we want to buy this from you. They said, yeah, great. Okay. Now, he did not give them $24 worth of trinkets. What he did trade with were iron kettles, iron axes, blankets, and other goods that the native peoples did not make themselves, and these were valuable to them. Now, the native peoples understood that the Dutch were merely leasing the land for a period of time. They never sold land, they basically leased it. And it's similar to the Jewish concept of the remittance year, where clan properties would revert back after a period of time to the original owners. The Dutch understood that they were buying it outright, and down the road, this created a problem. Because of this custom of leasing and reverting for a period of time, and other customs similar to Jewish practices, it supported belief by Dutch religious leaders that the indigenous peoples in the New World were really descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. And in part 2, we'll discuss this. Now, what did the New Amsterdam colony look like? This is a drawing of the layout of the town in 1654. Here we go. This is what the colony looked like in 1654 when the first Jews arrived. Wait, excuse me. This is the fort. Well, you can't see it as well as you did in the other picture, but there was a windmill and warehouses and a gallows. And this is a church that would become Trinity Church later on. And here is the famous wall of Wall Street. You'll see it better in another picture, but this is an actual drawing of what the wall looked like. You notice they're all dressed logs in a row, and this is the person who would be standing watch inside the colony against people coming up to the wall. Okay, the next, this is a better picture of what the colony actually looked like. This is the wall. We see the public well where everybody got their water. Another image of the fort, the flagpole, and a flag was raised whenever a ship was coming into port. This was the administration house where the governor stayed. And you notice it's really a very small colony. It didn't have a tremendous population. It's really quite small. The Dutch conquered Brazil. Well, we're going back. This thing is incredibly sensitive. Okay, let's stop here. The Dutch conquered Brazil from the Portuguese in 1637, and soon after the conquest, 400 Dutch Jews answered the call. for skilled settlers and went to Brazil. When Portugal reconquered Brazil in 1654 and brought along the Inquisition, the new Christians who had been living openly as Jews in Dutch Brazil had to leave. 23 Brazilians booked passage on the sailing ship St. Catherine, intending to go to Amsterdam, but their ship was attacked by Spanish pirates in the Caribbean and their cargo was stolen. The ship's captain agreed to take them to New Amsterdam in return for a fixed price. And once they arrived, most of these Jews couldn't raise the money, even after selling whatever remaining possessions they had. And this is how the story of the first 23 Jews in New Amsterdam begins. This is what the 23 Jews saw when the St. Catherine approached New Amsterdam. And again, we explained all the features that they saw: the fort, the flagpole, the wall. And this is, if they did actually get off the ship, this is a street scene of New Amsterdam in the time of Peter Stuyvesant, the governor. And we see again a windmill, group of houses, dirt mud roads, cattle, it looks like a hog. And this is basically what it looked like in 1654. Now, Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of New Amsterdam, oops, back up. This is Peter Stuyvesant, who was then the governor of New Amsterdam. He didn't want these Jews in his colony. He also didn't want the other Jewish merchants who were on their way from Holland. In addition, he didn't want Catholics, Quakers, Lutherans, or anyone who wasn't a Calvinist. This is the letter that Peter Stuyvesant wrote to the directors of the Dutch West India Company on September 22nd, 1654. Asking them to allow him to kick the Jews out. Now I'm going to read it to you because unfortunately this is blocking the screen. Okay. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning that they, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, as also to the people having the most affection for you, the deaconry also fearing that owing to their present indigence, they might become a charge in the coming winter. We have, for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place, and the land in general, deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart, praying also most seriously in the connection for ourselves as also for the general community of your worships, that the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, not be allowed to further infect and trouble the new colony to the detraction of your worships and the dissatisfaction of your worship's most affectionate subjects. However, among the directors of the Dutch West India Company were several influential Jews who interceded on the refugees' behalf. Company officials rebuffed Peter Stuyvesant and ordered him in a letter dated April 26, 1655, to let the Jews stay. And here's the text of the letter that the Dutch West India Company sent back. And it's very interesting for the contemporary tone of the letter. We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territories should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation. For we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear. But after having further weighed and considered the matter, we observe that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by that nation with others in the taking of Brazil. And here's the key part of it. As also because of the large amount of capital which they still have invested in the shares of this company. Money talks. Therefore, after many deliberations, we have finally decided and resolved to apostille, which means annotate, upon a certain petition presented by said Portuguese Jews, that these people may travel and trade to and live in New Netherlands and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. And this is a key phrase that I'm sure Peter Stuyvesant didn't like. You will now govern yourself accordingly. Stuyvesant, this was not the end, but not for Peter Stuyvesant. He only grudgingly agreed to this. He denied permission to one of these early Jewish settlers, one Salvatore de Andrade, to purchase a house and lot in New Amsterdam. He curtailed the right of Abraham de Lucena and others to sell goods to other parts of the colonies, specifically in the Delaware River area. And he levied a special military tax on Jewish settlers in August of 1655, despite their protests. Jews were not permitted to mount guards at the wall along with other citizens, and they had to pay a tax because of that. And we'll discuss this in part 2. And this was a major issue for Jewish rights in the colony. Further Jewish appeals to the directors at home resulted in a vigorous reprimand to Peter Stuyvesant, coupled with more specific directions in favor of Jewish settlers, expressly providing that they should enjoy all the civil and political rights in New Netherlands, which were accorded them in Amsterdam, and including express authorizations to acquire real estate and to trade in adjacent colonies. However, there were specific limitations on these rights, and these were included in the instructions. Let's take a look at these limitations. Jews or Portuguese people. Now in Amsterdam, Portuguese people was another name for Jews, since the newly arrived Jews had come from Portugal. So they were also referred to as Portuguese people. However, shall not be employed in any public service to which they are neither admitted in the city of Amsterdam, nor allowed to have open retail shops, but they may quietly and peacefully carry on their business as before said, and exercise in all quietness their religion within their houses, for which end they must, without doubt, endeavor to build their houses close together in a convenient place on one or the other side of New Amsterdam at their choice, as they have done here. So they have full rights, which they would have had in Amsterdam with these exceptions. Now, we consider the limited or non-existent rights of Jews in most of Europe at the time. This was an incredible concession, absolutely incredible. New Amsterdam never attracted a large Jewish population. It never attracted a large Dutch population either. Most people came to the New World for either religious freedom, if they were being persecuted in their home country, or economic opportunity. Because in a lot of Europe, if you weren't the eldest son or didn't marry the daughter of someone who had a business or a trade, you really were out of luck in terms of economic advancement or even being able to support yourself. So many people came to the New World basically for economic reasons or to avoid religious persecution. The reason you didn't get too many Dutch colonists here is economic conditions in Holland were really very good. And unlike other parts of Europe, the local population did not have to emigrate for a better life. And while the Dutch did not immigrate in large numbers to New Amsterdam, those who did immigrate were typically members of displaced groups like the French Protestants, the Huguenots, Jews, and Germans, including down the road German Jews. As a result, New Amsterdam had a very diverse population, just like New York City does now. In fact, many languages were spoken in New Amsterdam, and only a minority of people actually spoke Dutch. When the British arrived and guaranteed that people could maintain their commercial rights and privileges, most citizens remained and happily signed a loyalty oath to the British overlords. Now, question, if the population of New Amsterdam was always small, how was the town built and maintained? How did all these buildings get built? How did they get maintained? Who unloaded the ships? Who did everything? The answer is slavery. New Amsterdam, then New York, was the second largest slave state in what became the Union after South Carolina. Under the Dutch, slavery was a unique and fairly liberal institution compared to the rest of the country, or for that matter, the rest of the world. And we'll examine that in part 2, as well as the changes and suppressions of enslaved Africans under English rule. But that'll be for part 2. Why was the issue of Jewish rights settled through a commercial company, the Dutch West Indies Company, and not through legislation? And as we said before, New Amsterdam was essentially a company town, and it was controlled by the Dutch West India Company. The directors of the company made all the decisions. And unlike other colonies operating under a charter, this was a purely commercial enterprise. How did the Jews earn a living in New Amsterdam? The Jews in New Amsterdam were prohibited from engaging in retail trade at the beginning. They couldn't open a store. They were allowed to engage in intercontinental, intercolonial, and also foreign trade. And with ties to conversos scattered around the world, the Jews of New Amsterdam became very successful and contributed to the commercial success of the Dutch. Jews became the pioneers in foreign trade in New Netherlands and continued throughout the whole colonial period to be among the most prominent importers and exporters of goods in the colonies. And we'll get to that when we take a look at individual Jewish families in part 2. We'll also look at the lives of these first Jewish families, their occupations, Jewish religious practices, and support for the American Revolution. Now we come to the English colonial period. In 1664, Charles II, King of England, gave New Amsterdam to his brother, the Duke of York, who later became King James II. He just gave it to him. Here you are, it's yours. New York was classified as a proprietary colony. Remember, New Amsterdam was a company store, basically, a company colony. As a proprietary colony, it meant that New York was the property of James, Duke of York. In August of 1664, 4 English warships arrived in the New Amsterdam harbor to take over the town, and the English renamed it New York, obviously after the Duke of York. That's at that time, Peter Stuyvesant surrendered the New Amsterdam colony to the British. The Dutch colonists who were living there begged him to surrender before the British could fire a shot because they didn't want their town destroyed. And the cannon of the British warships could have easily leveled the town. They didn't want that. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda, which formally gave the British control of New Amsterdam from the Dutch, guaranteed full rights of worship, trade, individual property, and inheritance to all the inhabitants of the former New Netherlands colony. The Articles of Capitulation, which turned New Amsterdam over to the British, guaranteed to all residents the rights of free citizens and all their property rights, and provided that the Dutch there should enjoy liberty of conscience. Conscience, of course, being another word for religion. It was apparently because of these terms that Jewish residents under the new order were able to keep their established rights. It was a principle of English law that conquered territory continued to be governed by its former laws, except so far as new laws would be enacted. Slavery was the exception, and we'll see that in part 2. In 1665, the new English governor, Richard NICOLLS, promulgated the Duke's Laws, which contained a clause safeguarding religious rights. But the terms referred only to persons who profess Christianity. Further laws provided immunity from religious persecution to persons who profess faith in God by Jesus Christ. Now, apparently, this sounds like a setback for the Jews, but apparently this wasn't enforced because a synagogue was already built and opened, which would become the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. And Jewish clergy were already recognized and given privileges that were extended to all clergy in terms of the draft and other obligations. And this will be discussed in greater detail in part 2. So the law was there, but apparently nobody enforced it. The Jews were recognized as British subjects. Now, this was an important issue. The Jews eagerly wanted to acquire citizenship in New York as they had when it was New Amsterdam, when they sought their burger rights. In New Amsterdam, being a burger meant you were a citizen. And don't forget, the claim to this privilege was already established, so the English simply maintained this. During the English period, many new arrivals oh, for crying out loud. Excuse me for just a moment. Please excuse me for just a moment. Excuse me, I have to find my password. Excuse me for just a moment. Sorry about this. I'm very sorry. This is unprofessional, and I apologize. Okay. During the English period, many new arrivals secured governor's letters of what was called denization, which is actually naturalization, and they were licensed to trade and to traffic. It wasn't until 1740 that Parliament passed an act permitting foreign Jews to be naturalized in the colonies. The New York Colonial Assembly freely passed special acts, first applicable only to individuals and then to everybody, permitting Jews to be naturalized without including in their oath the words, "upon the true faith of a Christian." Now, this phrase was very common in oaths and anything that people had to do to assume office. And this actually prevented Jews from serving as witnesses in court or being sworn into political or civil office. Citizenship granted the Jews and their property protection under the law, a right denied them in most of Europe at the time. In 1727, the General Assembly of New York removed the stipulation that the phrase, "on the true faith of a Christian," was required for the oath of citizenship. And by the end of the 17th century, the end of the 1600s, Jews in New York City were able to purchase land, engage in retail trade, stand guard, and worship in public. New York was the main Jewish center in colonial America until about 1720, and Jews in New York held political office. On the eve of the American Revolution, they enjoyed almost all the rights of the Protestant majority. On the eve of the revolution in 1773, the New York community stagnated to just fewer than 250 Jews. And by the way, in part 2, we'll talk about the issue of a small Jewish population and what people had to do if they wanted to marry Jewish. And we'll do that in part 2. And again, these were mostly Western Sephardim who came from Holland, England, and the Caribbean islands, and a small number of Ashkenazi Jews who came from Germany. Just prior to the revolution, the Jewish population in New York began to shrink even further. Some moved to Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, and others intermarried. And to those who intermarried within a generation, the families were no longer Jewish. This concludes part 1. Whoops. This concludes part 1. Oh, we have some time. I forgot to show you one more slide. I'd like to show it to you. Because this is important. I don't know why it's not letting me do this. Okay. Let's try one more time. Here we go. Okay. There was one thing I'd like you all to see. You remember how New Amsterdam looked in 1654? This is how New York looked in 1776. You notice how different it looked from the way it looked. Do you see this?
No.
You're not seeing it. Okay, let's see what we can do. For some reason, I'm not being allowed to share the screen. Can you see this?
Yes. We see New Amsterdam, yes.
Yeah, you see that, good. Okay, now I want to, now look at the size of New Amsterdam in 1664. And this is what New York looked like in 1776. Look at the difference. See how built up it is. Now the streets are not paved yet. These are redcoat troops. New York was Tory, you remember that. But just to show you the difference, the way it was built up, you can't even see beyond the horizon. And that's how New York looked in 1776. Okay, I'd like to, this concludes part 1. Next week in part 2, we'll look at the lives of individual Jewish families in New Amsterdam and in New York, their occupations, their relations with their European and indigenous neighbors, their standing in the community, their religious practices, including the scandals in the synagogue, and their loyalties during the revolution. Next week, please join us again Monday, August 16th at 7 p.m. for part 2. If you have any questions, and please, let's just questions. If you have any questions, you can click on participants, find your name. See, I can't unmute you, but you can unmute yourself. So you'll see a microphone icon, and if you're muted, just click on it and we'll be able to hear you. And be gentle because I'm very sensitive.
Thanks, Toby. A wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Hope to see next week we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual people's lives. And it's incredible how they live. What I find even more incredible is how this is so contemporary, because all of their issues are so contemporary to what we're facing now. So I thank all of you for coming. Next week will probably also be about the same time. Oh, Debbie, thank you. Holly, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it was so interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And everybody,
Thank you, Toby.
Toby, thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I had fun. This was a lot of fun. Those of you who weren't here at the beginning, did you hear what Jamie said about all these developments in Israel for water reclamation?
No.
If you did,
No.
well, he mentioned that something that he saw at an APAC convention, and it's something I'd like to try to bring in someone to speak about it to one of our sisterhood meetings, because this is so relevant. Water, we're going to face serious water shortage if we aren't already. So I'd like to bring that in. Hopefully see everybody next week at 7 for part 2. And thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for
Thanks,
doing this.
Toby.
Very much for doing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye
now.
Good night. Good night. Good night. Take care.